Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us. We are going to get started now. We are so happy that everyone is here to join us for the webinar on the crumbling state of employee communication. My name is Robyn Hannah. I am the Senior Director of Global Communication here at Dynamic Signal, and I am joined by my friend, Mark Ragan. Hi, Mark.
Hello, everyone. Hi, Robyn.
Thanks so much for... I'm well. I'm so excited to do this with you. I feel like we get to talk about this stuff together all the time, and I'm glad that we're taking it to a wider audience. Now, Mark, I know that you have some exciting new stuff to share with us. Ragan's got some pretty cool stuff going on that I'm happy for you to tell us about, while you also introduce who you are and what you do for those of our audience who may not know you.
Thank you, Robyn. Thank you very much. Yes, so I'm the CEO of Ragan Communications. Many of you know us, I'm sure. I see a lot of our customers on here. We serve the corporate communications community, but our legacy is internal communications. Even though we serve PR people, social media people, brand reputation people, everyone in corporate communications. Been around for about 50 years. And Ragan.com is our main website, followed by PR Daily. Just for those of you who are thinking, who is this guy with the dog? So 50 years, my father started as an internal communicator at the Ford Motor Company in 1968 and launched Ragan. And we're very proud to say that our legacy is actually internal communications. It's something that people still think of us as being the leading voice, really, for internal communicators. And the thing that I wanted to announce today, and I hope everybody's got a pen in hand because I'm going to ask you to do something, is right before Christmas, Ragan launched its first membership organization. It's called the Internal Communications Leadership Council. And it's been an amazing success. We launched it right before Christmas, and we have about 60 members, lots of household brands like Siemens, Microsoft, Whirlpool, American Express, and we would like all of you to be part of this. So write down my email address so that I can tell you more. It's mark.ragan@ragan.com. And I would love to be able to get on the phone with you and see if your organization would like to join. That's it. That's it for my commercial, Robyn.
No, I love it. I think what you're doing is helping communication professionals move forward at a time when it's critical that we modernize how we communicate with employees. So we're excited for that. I'm looking at some of the questions now. I'm glad that everyone appreciated the appearance of Checkers. So did I. Again,
did Checkers get some fan mail?
He did. I feel like Checkers might need an Instagram handle pretty soon. Again, the hashtag to join us on Twitter and after is hashtag DieSciWebinar. So for those of you who are asking, hashtag DieSciWebinar. Mark, your Twitter handle, you want to give a shout out to your Twitter handle?
Yes, it's Mark Ragan, CEO.
There it is, guys. I'm at Robyn Hannah, and we are at Dynamic_Signal, and Katie Ruback on the DieSci team will be monitoring that live. So, all right, let's jump in here, Mark. As you guys all know, Dynamic Signal did a survey earlier this year and a study around the crumbling state of employee communication. We surveyed communication professionals and C-suite executives and general employees. And what we found that employees aren't feeling awesome, despite how hard we know communication professionals are working. They were confused, they were filled with anxiety about missing critical information, and they felt like they were wasting time trying to find the resources that they needed. 75% actually reported wasting significant time looking for important information because they've got to go from maybe a Dropbox to an intranet, or was it in their email? And there's all these different places, which is creating a lot of stress. And also employees aren't feeling valued. They're not feeling engaged. They're not feeling connected, which we know is a huge initiative for communication professionals. So why do you think this is happening, Mark? Why are employees so stressed out today?
Well, let's focus on that first statistic in the lower left-hand corner. 75% reported wasting significant time looking for important information. Robyn, I think everyone on this webinar maybe there might be a few exceptions, would say their intranet sucks. Let's begin there. I mean, the intranet continues to be one of the main ways that we communicate to employees. And yet, everyone, with a few exceptions, the 574 people that are on here, if I could ask them to raise their hands, which none of us will see, all of them would say that their intranet is sluggish, that employees hate it, they have a hard time finding things. It's not the most efficient way to communicate to employees. The next thing we have is people still rely on email communication. This kind of drives me crazy because we all hate email, or at least we say we hate email. And yet I was with the chief communications officer at our first leadership council meeting just last week, and they were saying that email is their primary way, other than their intranet, communicating with employees. And we all hate that. I mean, how many times you get an email where it's reply to all, and you're on the string that goes on forever. So we have we have bad emails. And let me talk about a third problem. When I entered the business in 1995 and took over Ragan Communications from my father, we had essentially one communication channel. It was the employee newsletter. I always ask people, do you remember what the employee newsletter was called back then? I'll bet almost no one remembers this. It was called the House Organ. Now, how's that for a weird title? The House Organ.
Yeah.
I'd love to, Robyn, we should ask people, any older people in the rooms around the world that remember the term house organ. But that was the only way we communicated. In fact, my father was the editor of the house organ for the Ford Motor Company. Now look at all the channels that we have. And not only in our business life, but our personal life. So we're sitting there toggling back and forth between Twitter and Facebook and LinkedIn and Instagram, and it's confusing. That's just our personal life. And yet, and here's the fundamental point, we rely on those channels to communicate with friends, but we're not doing the same thing in the corporate world.
Right.
So we have these, what I call worlds colliding, right? We have all these wonderful tools in our personal life that are quick, easy, and accessible on this, Robyn, right here. Yeah. This is where people live their lives today.
Right. This is how we communicate. This is the modern way.
We have this weird thing where we're not communicating to employees on this. So that's one answer to your question. There's a disconnect.
Yes, I agree. And I think you brought up some really good points about the different places and the different channels we use today versus the one way that we used to do it before. And that's created all these different places to go look. And many communicators haven't found a great way to streamline, which next to modernizing, streamlining is really important. And so now we're seeing this crisis happen, that employees can't tell what's important and what's irrelevant because they're getting so much information. I think sometimes there's this sort of spray and pray approach, right? Like we'll just send them everything and hope that they get what they needed. But
I love that. I love that spray and approach, because if we could ask all of the 603 now participants in this webinar, how many of you have experienced this, where you sent out the same message over multiple channels, you posted it on your intranet, perhaps you did a video, you certainly did an email communication, then you have somebody come up in the hallway and say, why didn't anybody tell me about this deadline? How come I didn't know about this new initiative? And we want to walk up to the wall, right, everybody, and just bang our heads against it. It's like, oh my gosh, I told you 50 times. Now, why does that happen, Robyn? I think it happens because, number one, the channel overload. Nobody knows where to go for information. Number two, we're relying on email too much. So that typical communicator or that typical employee who's getting 100 emails a day, it's in those emails are critical information from the company. And number three, and I hate to say this, we're not focusing as well as we should on the types of content that we should be sharing, right?
You know, I think the other part is that there's a lack of measurement. So people are having to send an email and an intranet and a Slack post or a Yammer post, and they're not getting the measurement, so they don't actually know who saw what. So they have to continue. And then when someone comes up in the hallway and says, I didn't see this, it's very possible that they didn't, right? But you have no way to know if you're not measuring on the back end.
I have, at our leadership council meeting, we had about 30 heads of communication last week in Atlantic Beach. And if I ask for a show of hands, how many of you, and now I want you to all keep this in mind. These are the bosses. These are the senior VPs, directors, and senior managers of employee communications. And only 2 people raised their hand and said that they were satisfied with their internal measurement program. Now, I hate to be too theatrical about this, but if you're not satisfied with your measurement program, if you're not getting real-time statistics on how your employees are consuming your information and how they feel about it, if you don't have the ability to measure that day in and day out, and perhaps even in real time, how do you as the content producer constantly tailor your messages so that you know that people are receptive to them? So
right,
and may be, I'm so glad you brought it up, Robyn. Measurement may be the #1 thing that communicators need to do to get that seat at the management table, which is what everyone wants. Robyn, you've heard me say this many times, that so many communicators, if we polled the 619 participants, they would say they feel like order takers in their organization. They feel as if they should put a Kinko's apron on and that they're standing behind a desk and people are coming up to them and spinning them like crazy. I need a brochure. I need a new email. I need a poster. I once had a senior VP from a major Fortune 10 company tell me that his phone rang one day and he was asked if he could supply tent cards for a meeting with the company. We have to stop being order takers and start to be strategic counselors. But I wanted to say, if we don't have measurement, if we cannot present to our leaders in our organization the facts of life, if we can't tell them, for example, if we can't tell the CEO that nobody is reading his or her column or nobody's watching his or her video because it's boring, if we don't have the measurement to back up our opinions, then what are we going to do? How do we get that seat at the table?
That's right, because from our study, and some of you are asking, we surveyed employees, the C-suite, and we'll get to those responses in a minute, and communication professionals, and all the methodology for our study is available in the report, which you can download from dynamicsignal.com/resources, and we'll have a link to that at the end of this. And for those of you who are asking, yes, we are recording this, and we will make sure to send a copy to everyone who is registered for the webinar. So Mark, as we look through this, the struggle is real, right, for communication professionals. We're working so hard. It feels like we're working harder than ever, and yet we're still seeing that there's a gap, right? 48% of communication professionals that we surveyed reported that employees have blamed unclear communication for poor job performance. They didn't know where to get something. They didn't know they had to do something. They weren't aligned on the company goals for the year. They didn't hear it from the CEO, like, these are our priorities, this is what we're focused on. 50% report that their company is suffering financially. And I think that's something that you and I have talked about quite a bit, that communication is a critical business function. And historically, it's been sort of seen as this soft part of business. But there's a real bottom line impact when your employees aren't aligned, when they're not engaged, when they don't know how to prioritize or where to get resources or information. 56% said that they're still struggling to keep employees informed. So why do you think that this is happening when we're starting to get some great tools, right? We've got new resources. I think many people, as we mentioned before, are using all these different channels, and yet there's still this big struggle.
Well, it's something that, let's take the 56% number. And for all of you on the webinar, that's the left-hand column at the very top. 56% say they struggle to keep employees informed. Why is that? I could write a book just on that statistic alone. First of all, it starts at the C-suite. It starts with leadership. I would ask everyone who is on this, we're up to 636 participants, How many of you would say your C-suite believes in internal communications, that they think it's absolutely fundamental, and they think it's so important that they have you in critical meetings so that you could be ahead of the curve when there's a crisis or when a new initiative is rolling out? I would say it's probably a fairly small percentage that have the attention of their leadership. So we start there. We start with that issue of do all of those folks up in the ivory tower believe in you? Do they believe that communication really makes a difference? And so when we say that 56% say they struggle to keep employees informed, I would say one of the reasons is that perhaps their leadership, boy, and I'm going to say something very controversial here, doesn't really care that much whether employees are informed about things like bad news, things like declining sales, things like low morale, or products that aren't selling. If that's the case in your organization, then it's up to us to inform the C-suite, why is it? What is the link between keeping those employees informed, even if it's bad news, even if it's stuff that the C-suite tends to not want to share? Why is that important? And what is the correlation between giving employees candid and honest news that is written clearly and, yes, entertainingly? What is the correlation between that and product sales, employee engagement, retention, and all of those things? So and by the way, that's just one. It just starts there. And then you go from there to all the technical reasons why employees don't feel like they're informed. And those are the things we talked about in the first 10 minutes.
Yeah, I mean, we talked about how communication can impact general productivity, and we see from this study that 51% report that employee productivity hasn't improved or even worsened because of communication tools and the guidance on how to use them. And I think that's key, right? If you have Slack for some people in your company and Yammer for some people, but then the internet is important and HR is keeping all that stuff there, and you've also got Workday, and you've also got email, and some people are using text or WhatsApp groups. There are all these different places, right? And it's actually negatively impacting productivity. How can communicators kind of get their arms around that so that these tools can work to our benefit to increase productivity?
Okay, well, I'm going to give you the answer, Robyn. Start with a communications audit. Let's throw this question out. I'm going to throw this question out to our 642 people. How many of you have done a communications audit within the last year? And now when I say audit, I hope you're not thinking employee engagement survey. That's something.
Yeah, we've got quite a few people who are raising their hand and saying that they've done one recently. I'd also be curious to know how, and Mark, I'd love your thoughts. How often should people be doing a communication audit to really understand, have they modernized? Are they streamlining? Do they have the measurement? Are they being impactful and really increasing productivity and fixing this 50% who say that their company's struggling financially?
Yeah, I would say that all those people raising hands, I'd like to know what the percentage is at the end of the poll. But I would say the communications audit has to look at every single channel that you're using. So if you're using Slack, for example, are you including that in the communications audit? Are you including your intranet in the communications audit? So there are companies, for example, where there are rogue communication tools. So for example, you've got your main intranet, but you find out that the favorite communication tool is over here that nobody's paying attention to, right? It's there are groups of employees that are going rogue, essentially, using communication tools that the corporate communications department isn't measuring. Now, why is that audit important? Because that audit is going to give you the measurement, the statistics you need to make your case perhaps to trim some of your channels or abolish them outright. It's also going to tell you things, and here's something, again, controversial, that you already know. Robyn, well, I want to expand on that. Most of the communicators, I dare say, the 644 people on this webinar, they know what isn't working. It's all of our little secret. They know that the CEO column sucks. They know that that email is not resonating among employees. They know it, but they don't have the metrics to back it up. And without metrics, they can't kill it. So for example, if the CEO's column is the most boring piece of crap anybody has ever written, yes, crap, it's a technical term. We use it in internal comms. Everybody knows what I mean by crap because we put it out every day. But we need metrics to be able to say to the people that are producing that crap, hey, it's not working. We did a communications audit, Ms. CEO, of your, you know, that column you write, you know, the column that every week says the only change, you know, the only thing we have to fear is change, you know, those kinds of ridiculous columns. We can't go to them and say it sucks, but we can say the metrics show that nobody's reading it. And so without those metrics, let me give you a mantra that I use with my Ragan communication customers. Go up to your leadership, don't ever do this, and say, I want this, or I want a 4-color magazine, or I want, and what you get is the metric show. So abolish the I want part and replace it with the metrics show. This email isn't working. That this brochure that you had me spend thousands of dollars on isn't working. It isn't resonating. But the only way you can do that is with an audit. Now, if you have a tool, and if you have a tool like Dynamic Signals tool, for example, which we use at Ragan, if you have a tool to measure that in real time, then think of all the power and ammunition you're going to have to be able to get things you want.
Yeah, you know, I think another important part to mention is that the communication audit can't just happen with employees with whom you can reach or you can speak with over email, right? There are a lot of frontline employees who aren't sitting behind a desk or behind a computer, who maybe don't even have a corporate email address, but these are your customer-facing employees in a lot of instances, whether it's retail or you know, hospital workers working with patients, or in a restaurant scenario, or truck drivers who are delivering your product. So would you recommend including all of those types of deskless and dispersed employees in an audit as well, and trying to figure out what they need from you? Because it's probably very different than what people who can access the internet from their computer, right?
Would I recommend it? It's absolutely the one thing you have to do. Do you know the number one question, Robyn, I get at every single Ragan conference? Number one. Number two is far behind. How do I communicate to deskless and dispersed workforce? And by the way, I have a tiny little company in Chicago, and yet I have employees in Sweden, Alabama, North Carolina, Chicago, New York. I have employees all over the world. If I didn't have the Dynamic Signal app, and I'm sorry, I don't want this to sound like a promotion, but I'm a huge believer.
I'm not mad.
No, I mean, I really am a huge believer. I posted just a few minutes ago on our Dynamic Signal app. I mean, if I didn't have that app, I wouldn't be able to communicate as often as I do. For example, when I'm on the road, Robyn, this is what I love about the app. When I'm on the road and I'm, say, talking to a customer at a Ragan Communications conference, I can grab that customer in an instant, shoot a video, and have that video posted so my employees can be proud of the work that we're doing. You know, most of my employees don't get to go to Ragan conferences. So with that simple app, I can communicate to them, and I can measure how many people really thought that video is worth watching. But I'm digressing. To your point, yes, you have to include in your communication audit, you have to include all of those folks that aren't in front of a computer necessarily, because those people are critical. How are you going to communicate to them if they're not in front of the computer every day?
Right. And actually, I think sometimes that's where to start, right? Start with those employees that you can't reach another way. Those are sort of the most important ones. If you've got another way, you've got some way to communicate with some of these folks, and you can't with others, maybe start there. Because here's what our survey showed. a third of employees are report being ready to quit because they are so stressed out by poor communication in the workplace. The employee stress index is through the roof right now. 53% said they felt overwhelmed and felt a pressure to check multiple communication platforms. What do we need to be doing about this?
Well, first of all, it's not just, I want to be clear, it's not just the fact that there are multiple platforms. We know that. That is definitely a problem. The reason those employees are stressed is because inside, in their hearts and in their minds, they know that something is wrong at the company. But nobody is telling them. Nobody is telling them that perhaps we may have layoffs in a few months. Perhaps our sales aren't going as well as they should be. It's this fear of bad news. It's this fear of candor. It's this fear of being honest and open with employees. And so one of the things we have to do as employee communicators is constantly be correlating this bad morale, if there is bad morale, or high or low retention rates. We have to be correlating that with, are we being upfront with our employees? Do they know where they are at any given time at the company? And even more importantly, Robyn, do they know what's expected of them? Now, we start there. But once we can do this kind of candid talking to of our employees, we have to think, okay, how do we do it in the most efficient way? And that's where the technology comes to bear. Again, I'm going to hold this up again and say, we use this all of the time, the cell phone. I'm holding up my cell phone right now. We use this all the time. In fact, there are days where I never go to my laptop. Aren't our employees similar in that regard? Aren't our employees, our truck drivers, the retail workers on our shop floors, the factory workers, are they not also on their phones? We have got to be able to communicate to them effectively and candidly. And if we have time later, we could talk about how do you communicate to people on a cell phone as opposed to on an intranet or an email. We got to keep it short. We have to have great images. We have to be able to create content that is just as entertaining. And what I mean by entertaining is emotional based. Is it funny? Is it provocative? Think of it this way. Can you imagine if we put out the same amount of content, the same quality of content on our cell phone that we do on our Facebook page? How would that be different? And I can't hear you.
Oh, yeah, no, sorry. We've got a bunch of great questions coming in here. We'll tell you more about how dynamic signal can work on the back end if you're interested. But Mark, do you want to just touch on why it's so important to sort of measure sentiment? We talk about these metrics that we need to get, but also the feeling of being overwhelmed and feeling pressure, because those are things that have a big impact on employee retention, churn, right? Customer satisfaction.
Yeah, and at the risk of me starting to sound like a curmudgeon, I've been sitting here listening to myself. I feel like I'm being kind of down curmudgeonly, and maybe I am. Maybe that's 25 years of serving internal communicators and really feeling their pain. I've turned into kind of a curmudgeon. But what was your question again?
Measuring, not just measuring open rates, but measuring sentiment.
Oh, sentiment. Okay, this is what I meant by the curmudgeonly aspect of my remark. At Ragan, I'm both on the external side and the internal side. So I communicate to employees the way our audience does, but I also am in charge of external marketing. Can you imagine if we didn't have the tools in marketing that allowed us to measure sentiment? I bet every single person on this webinar, if they walked across the hall to the PR side has Cision, they have focus, they have sentiment analysis on everything, right? Am I wrong here, Robyn? They have sentiment.
No, I use Air PR. We all check sentiment. It's an important thing, and I think marketing 10 years ago didn't have these things. Right? It's funny. There used to be that saying in advertising, I know 50% of my advertising works, I just don't know which 50. And I feel like communicators have had to work that way a bit.
Well, exactly. One way to put this is we should have all the tools that marketing has. If marketing walked into the C-suite and said, and let's say the chief marketing officer wanted to know what the results of their last direct email promotion, and can you imagine the marketer looking at that CMO and saying, gee, I don't know. Well, we sent out a bunch of emails, but I have no idea how they performed. That marketer would probably be fired by the end of the day. And yet that's exactly the situation internal communicators find themselves in all the time. They,
and speaking of the C-suite, our study also surveyed C-suite, the C-suite executives. And I'm curious to know if this sounds surprising to you. So let me walk you guys through this. So when we asked about how their employee communication was going and if it was strong and how it was performing and how employees felt, 81% said that at least 80% of their employees were aligned. 91% believe that the company provided the right tools and guidance for employee communication, and 93% said that they believe their employees could discern the noise from important information well or very well. So they felt like there was a lot of clarity, right? And as we saw,
they're the CEO. They never come out of they never come out of the executive office. Everything's fine.
Yes, right. And as we saw in the previous slides, communication professionals, employees are reporting something very different. But here's where it gets interesting. We push and we asked, did they ever personally miss any vital information daily or weekly? We asked if there had been, if anyone had missed a significant company objective or a goal because of ineffective communication. And look at the responses. So while they were all saying, yeah, everything's great, everyone's aligned, we've got all these tools, then we see 52% report a negative financial impact because of ineffective communication. So while their initial thoughts are, yeah, of course things are great, when you dig a little deeper, even the C-suite recognizes this gap. Does this part surprise you?
No, as a matter of fact, what doesn't surprise me was the first slide that the CEO thinks everything is just hunky-dory. By the way,
sure.
I wanted to go, my friend Diana Kowalski, who is an internal communicator at REI, had a couple of interesting comments here. I believe framing communications in terms of positive impact, what good comes of well-connected employees, is more productive for execs than the dire negative frame. Absolutely, Diana. I could not agree with you more. If we can take the measurement that we do from communication audits, from having technology like dynamic signal, if we can take those metrics and frame things, hey, look at this communication that we did that resulted in a higher retention rate or resulted in more people participating in our town hall. If we can do that in a positive way, then yes, we're really going to move the needle. Diana goes on to say, fear and candor is at its root squarely a leadership and cultural challenge. Communication problems are a symptom. I couldn't agree more. Thank you, Diana, for that. That was very important.
Yeah, I agree. That was great. And because this is where we're at today. We need one platform that'll help us modernize, streamline, so we don't have to put something on the internet and in an email and on a poster and say it in all hands and push it to Slack. Like, we need to streamline communication through one platform, and we need to measure the impact so that, like you said, we can earn that seat at the table, that we can go to a CEO or a CEO or a CFO and say, this is what the numbers are saying. We have data to show this.
Yes.
And it really means that there's not an option to not do this today. That employee expectations have shifted so much. And to your earlier point, we communicate in a different way in our personal lives. We're very mobile oriented. We expect modern, real-time, targeted, relevant information that comes to us through this distributed model, not a destination model. And yet that hasn't carried over to the workplace.
I agree completely. And I wanted to point out another comment from probably one of the most experienced communicators that I know of, Brad Whitworth, who said in their outside of work lives, people have multiple communication platforms. Can we realistically expect them to have just one platform in their work lives? And I would say, Brad, no. You are absolutely right in the implication of your question. No matter how hard we work, it's going to be very difficult to bring all employee communications down to one platform. But what I would say, Brad, is are we doing the right job in measuring the effectiveness of all of those platforms and trimming the ones that aren't working? That's number one. And number two, can we use technology that allows us to sync all of those platforms into one place? And a lot of the technology that is coming out today, including the host, Dynamic Signal, allows us to do that. How are we able to integrate all of these various tools into one easy-to-use mobile app or mobile device? But it is true, yes. And by the way, Brad, I would say, accepting the premise of your question, we all do use outside of work multiple platforms. But I don't know about you, but I'm, number one, kind of sick of it. And number two, I can't keep up. I can't keep up with Facebook, Twitter, Snapchat, LinkedIn, Instagram. So in a way, in some ways that you probably didn't anticipate, you're proving my point. It's really hard to keep up with all of those channels.
So tell me a little bit about how you are doing this at Ragan. Obviously, you're Ragan Communications. So if you don't have great employee communication, we have a big problem, right? So tell me about how you've created this employee-focused, community-driven program for communicating with your employees all over the world.
Well, I'll tell you this. I believe in candor, and I am a CEO. And I just called on CEOs to be more candid and honest. Our communication sucked at Ragan Communications for a long time, mostly because of this dispersed workforce problem, number one. As I said, we had employees all over the world. That was one problem. The second problem was it wasn't that we didn't want to communicate. As you can tell, as most of your folks can probably tell from this webinar, I'm really I believe in very candid, blunt communication. The problem was we didn't have a way to do it other than email. And email, everybody hated email. I mean, if you can imagine, and I bet this happens to a lot of you who are listening, every time we would send out an email about company news where the subject line clearly reflected that it was coming from corporate communications, people wouldn't open it. People wouldn't click on it. So one of the wonderful things about using your app, the Dynamic Signal app, is that it's easy to use. It integrates all of the different channels that we use at Ragan or are planning to use. It's measurable, and it does certain things the way it's designed that I believe is in the forefront of communications. For example, you can't post an app, you can't post a update on Dynamic Signal's app. I hope I don't make a mistake here, at least the way we use it, without having an image that goes along with it. So you have to search for the right image, something that's catchy and grabby, and then post along with that image. That alone recognizes the way we live today.
Right.
Would you agree,
well,
Robyn?
Mark, in the latest update, actually, you can now do long form posts without an image. It's still best practice to use an image,
Exactly.
and our team really loves animated GIFs.
Now, we had a question here, Robyn, because we talked so much about measurement. Karen Richardson asked, can you describe what the die-side measurement tool is? And I'm wondering, would you do that? Yeah,
sure. I did want to, let me first say, Dynamic Signal, in addition to working with Ragan, who is obviously the leader in employee communication and engagement, we work with 20% of the Fortune 500, including a host of really incredible companies who are, who have had the same challenges that some of you have asked questions about in regards to gig workers and factory workers and people who don't have an email address with the company or don't sit behind a computer. So all these people are working to solve that problem, and they're using Dynamic Signal to do that. again, you can get this entire study at dynamicsignal.com/resources and download the whole study. And I want to remind you before I dive into the Q&A that we will have a live tweet chat right after this webinar, #DISI webinar at Mark Ragan CEO. And I know the conversation has already been taking off on Twitter. So back to measurement. Yeah, I think, and by the way, we'll send out a recording of this. And if you want to get a little bit of a better look at Dynamic Signal, we can get you on a demo with one of our fantastic sales team members. But there's a whole host of different reporting options. You can create custom reports, so you can kind of have these templates that you run every week or every month. There are survey tools. There's an employee NPS built into the platform, so you can start to get those benchmarks of how employees are feeling. Would they recommend your company to another job applicant? Do they feel more productive or less productive? So you can start to get all
whole surveys all the time, constantly.
Right.
Yeah.
We do them all the time. Yeah. Because like you, the stakes are high. Dynamic Signal, as the leader in employee communication engagement platforms, cannot have poor employee communication and engagement. So we do want to check in a lot and make sure that we're getting this right. But we can check how many people received a broadcast, how many people clicked through a post, what kind of content are people engaging with most, what's getting the most traction. And you can, the other great thing, and I think this is really important, back to our earlier conversation around what is relevant and what is important versus what is not, being able to target communication directly to people to whom it's most relevant, and not like the company newsletter that we've talked about before. Maybe one article in that is relevant to every employee, but if you can easily create and segment newsletters so all the content is relevant to those employees, you start to get better engagement, and we can track all that on the back end. But I do want to get to some of these, yeah.
Can I just sum up something before people start to leave, before the chat?
Well, you can, and I've got questions for you, so yeah.
Okay, but let me just summarize my points. Number one, please, all of you, especially the younger employee communicators that are on this webinar, please, if you take anything away from this webinar, take away the importance of measurement. Measurement does not come easy to employee communicators. A lot of us are liberal arts graduates. A lot of us are writers and editors, and we love the written word and we love content. But we also have to embrace measurement, because measurement is what's going to turn you from an order taker into a strategic counselor. No marketer would ever go before their chief marketing officer without metrics. Metrics are at the very heart of the marketer's job. I want you to think of yourself in some ways as a marketer. I want you to think of yourself as someone who is not only producing great content, but has to prove that that content is resonating. So that's number one. Once you have those metrics, then you have to fight for that seat at the table. But those metrics are going to make it easier for you to do so. Because instead of saying that I want something, please give me something, you're going to be able to back up your request with real-time data. Number three, please do not forget the importance of great, riveting, entertaining content. I cannot emphasize this enough. No matter what platforms you have, no matter what measurement systems you have, we always have to go back to content. Are we creating emotionally centered content that is resonating with our people? And with that, we can, Robyn, do you want to do the Q&A?
Yeah, just to add on to that, our customer at Sky, which is a huge cable company out in the UK, he says their internal comms, they say, would we publish this externally? And if the answer is no, it's not good enough for an external publication, then they don't publish it internally, because content is really important. So here's a question, Mark, that you and I have heard a bunch. I think someone asked, are cell phones truly the answer when phones are such a distraction? So there are companies that are still saying employees are not allowed on social media. You're not allowed to have your phone. I think we know that they're using them anyway, and for work too, right?
They said that about the fax machine. They said that about the fax. Oh, by the way, for the young people in the audience, this fax machine was a thing that used to sit in a corner, and you used to fax things to people. They said the same thing about fax machines. We can't have a fax machine. People will be wasting time on the fax machine. They said the same thing about the internet. We can't have the internet in the office. People will be checking their Facebook pages. So that's kind of crazy. I would just ask all of you who are listening right now, how many times do you rely on your mobile device to do things in your personal life? In fact, I want to come back to something I said at the beginning. Whatever you do in your personal life, ask yourself the question, why are you not doing this in the corporate communications department, right? Remember that metaphor I used of planets colliding? We can't rely on certain tools in our personal life that we're not using, or behaviors, by the way. Behaviors.
Yep.
We can't recognize certain behaviors in our personal life, but not recognize those same behaviors as an internal communicator.
Yep, and Allison just popped up with a good kind of question statement. These rogue channels pop up, right? Employees will find a way to communicate. It'll be a WhatsApp group, it'll be a closed Facebook page, it'll be a text thread, right? So when you have these hourly workers or dispersed workers, if we're not giving them the communication tools, they'll still find a way to communicate, right?
Oh yeah, I mean, I remember in the dawn of social media, a company, I think it might have been IBM, was freaking out because their Austin employees started a rogue Facebook page. And there was this idea, well, we've got to ban it. We've got to go to the person who started that page and ban it. But Ethan McCarty, who was a very forward-thinking communicator at IBM, said, we're not going to ban it. We're going to embrace it. We're going to embrace that channel because that's where employees are. A couple of things I wanted to talk about that go to the heart of what we just said, and I'm queuing this off comments here. Someone said, let's see, where is that? The rogue pages are so much more compelling. Well, Allison, why are they compelling? Why is the rogue page more compelling? And my guess is because it's honest, it's probably more entertaining, it's probably more human. And what does that tell you? If the rogue pages are more compelling, then what does that tell us about our task as communicators? We've got to match that content with content that we produce formally for our employees. In fact, Allison goes on to say, I've been stealing content from rogue FB pages and pushing it uphill internally, and I compliment you for doing that, because most likely the content on those rogue pages is far more human-centered. Go ahead, Robyn.
Well, right, but also, not necessarily productive, right? A lot of people use Slack in an organization, and you'll see a Slack conversation quickly devolve from, hey, we have an important all-hands meeting, to, I found some keys in the bathroom, to, does anyone want to grab lunch, right? I mean, the conversations can get a bit unwieldy in some of those rogue groups that, while really human, maybe aren't focused on being productive. So as communication professionals, we still have to find a way to meet them where they're at and create communication channels that are measurable and productive. We're getting a lot of questions about production line employees and factory employees. People are saying, hey, if they're on the floor, they don't have access to their phone. Is it, 60% of the time, is it still worth it? I would say the first thing they do when they get off that floor is check their phone. It's not go to a kiosk and log into an intranet. So I would still say yes. Mark, what are your thoughts on, and kind of a sideline question to that one is, would you include contract workers and gig workers in your communication audit? So talk to me about reaching those types of employees and whether mobile is worth it.
I bet there was a time in manufacturing, 100 years ago, there was a time where somebody said, we can never let anybody have access to phones at all. Because if they have access to phones, then they're going to waste time. So I see that as something that will eventually change. In fact, all of these things we've talked about in the mobile world will eventually change. CEOs will be dragged kicking and screaming, perhaps, to this, but it will change because we live our life on mobile devices. Now, somebody made the comment, it was Brian Hughes, who said, You've mentioned using mobile more in our professional capacity. Is there a risk that we are invading an area of people's lives that they may want to keep more for their personal use? And this is what I have to say. It's all about the content. Your job.
That's right.
Your job,
Right.
you probably spend 70% of your life doing something related to your work. I would say, Brian, you're absolutely right. If we keep spooning crap, then whether the crap appears on your intranet or whether the crap appears in your mobile device, it's an invasion. So here's the answer. Yes, the way to avoid invading their lives is by giving them content that's going to make them happy, that's going to help them, that's going to be useful, that they can't live without. And so the solution might be make it optional. Put the app out there and say, look, we know that you don't trust us right now. We know that we need to earn your trust, but we're going to put content out that is so necessary for you, so helpful, and perhaps even entertaining that you're going to want to download it.
Yep. By the way, hi, Brad. I saw your the mashup of all the social channels. That was funny. Lisa asked if it's possible to use something like this in a heavily regulated industry. And I can tell you from our experience, yes. And Mark, I know Ragan does some specific work with healthcare companies. We work with a ton of healthcare companies, pharma companies, financial institutions. And the reality is those employees are dying to get more information about what their company is doing. And there are ways, like you can talk about things like health and wellness or CSR activities, right? So even within a regulated industry, if you are sending targeted relevant information to them and even empowering them to share some of that externally in an employee advocacy kind of way, there are ways to do that. But those employees want to feel just as informed and connected as anyone else.
Absolutely.
Would you agree with that?
Oh, absolutely. And I would say if you looked at Ragan's DISI app, the content we put on there, it's not only strategic, but it's also fun. We have a lot of fun stuff on our app that keeps employees engaged. We have a social committee like so many companies have, right? And their principal way of communicating to employees is to tell them through the DISI app what's going on. We communicate benefits. We try to give them a feel. So many of our employees are out on the road all the time. We try to give them a feel of what their colleagues are doing when they're at conferences or when they're at like our leadership council last week. So I want you to think about the way you communicate as a mixture of strategic communication, stuff employees have to know to move the needle for their company, but also something that can be entertaining, can be fun, can make them feel that they're all part of one big group. Now, somebody might say, Robyn, well, heck, I can do that on the intranet. Well, yeah, but everybody hates the intranet. So, people, again, I always come back to this whole idea that people live on their smartphone and their devices. So we're running away from what people do in their personal lives when we ban that kind of communication on a device.
Right. Well, and coming back to the internet, some people are producing really incredible content for the internet, but because it's this destination model where people have to go, some employees are missing out on all that awesome work that the communication teams are doing. And so while the internet might be great, it's not always convenient, because at the end of the day, and this goes to one of the questions about just sort of best practices, at the end of the day, your employees are your most valued asset. You don't have a business without them. And they have to feel valued. They have to feel informed. They have to feel connected. And the reality is we hired them to do a job that is not reading internal communication. It is not going to the internet. So whenever we're speaking to them about something that they might need to know, or a tool or a resource or an asset they need to do their job, it's still sort of an interruption in their workflow. So if we can reach them where they're at with relevant, timely, compelling content, we can create the foundation that we need to have this aligned, engaged workforce. And I think that's really where the best practices lie. People talk about wanting brand ambassadors, employee advocates. Those are great outcomes of a strong, aligned, informed team.
Exactly.
Would you,
I couldn't agree more, Robyn. Well said. I'm trying to find a comment that was really wonderful. I'm going to have to, I can't find it because the questions are coming in. So, oh, here it is, Lisa Morris. Thanks, but part of our problem is the fun stuff is easy. It's the regulatory items and such that become difficult for them to wade through. Okay, this is, Lisa, you're right, but most of the time, it's because the serious stuff is not done the right way. I mean, for 15 years, I've been running a workshop called Advanced Writing and Editing, and we hammer this home all the time, that the regulatory stuff, the serious initiatives, the process stories, they have to have human beings part of them. We have to, we have to build narratives that are just as interesting, just as fun about that serious stuff as the personal things like what the social committee is doing. And this is what I mean by good content is ultimately platform agnostic, right? If you have great content, then people will read it. Now, the difference, of course, is if your platform has become so sullied, your platform is so hated in the organization that you're almost wasting your time producing that content because people have learned not to go to your intranet or not to open your emails. But the solution to the serious stuff is to insert human beings, think of writing stories where there's a lot of dramatic tension and people doing things.
Yeah, I think that's key. At the end of the day, we have to remember that our employees are people first. They don't check their humanity at the door before they head into the factory or the hospital or the office or the retail store, right? They're still people, and we need to communicate with them like they're people. We are right at the top of the hour. So Mark, I just want to thank you so much for sharing all of your exciting ideas and your insights and all the experience that you have with this audience today. As a reminder, we will send out a recording of this webinar, and we'd love for you guys to all tune into Twitter right now to join us on the tweet chat. It's #DieSciWebinar. Mark's handle is @MarkRaganCEO. I'm @Robyn Hannah, and we are @dynamic_signal. And one more time before we go, if you want to download the report that we talked about, it's at dynamicsignal.com/resources. If you want to learn more about the exciting leadership council that Mark Ragan and the Ragan team have put together, his email address is mark.ragan@ragan.com. Is that right, Mark?
It is, and can I ask everyone, we still have 320 people on the, I'd also love them to connect to me over LinkedIn. I don't, we talked about social channels earlier, Robyn. I'm a LinkedIn junkie. I love LinkedIn. So if you guys don't mind sending me a connection request, then if you have any questions for me or any follow-ups, but please, all of you who are senior managers and directors and VPs of internal comms, I want you on our leadership council. We had our first meeting last week, and it was absolute, I call it, equal parts group therapy, benchmarking, idea sharing. It's an amazing council. So connect to me on LinkedIn and send me an email, and I'd love to set up an individual call with you to tell you about the benefits of the council. Thanks, Robyn. By the way, most people don't realize this. Robyn is the internal communicator at Dynamic Signal, and she identifies with all of us in corporate communications and does an amazing job. Thank you, Robyn.
Thanks, Mark. I appreciate you. And I'm excited to keep this conversation going on Twitter. So head over to Twitter and join us, #DieSciWebinar. Mark, thank you so much. And I'm going to continue this digitally now. Have a great day, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.